Hello, dear friend. It's me again, your guide through the controversial parts of history that don't lie on the surface of textbooks but hide in dusty archives and under the gloss of post-war victory reports. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss new investigations. Things are going to get even more intense. And please, drop a couple of lines in the comments below. It's incredibly important for me to know your opinion, because this conversation isn't just about the past. It's about why the world looks the way it does today. Today, I invite you to look behind the curtain of the Great Victory. You've probably seen the newsreels, the fallen Berlin, the shattered columns of the Wehrmacht, the Nuremberg trials where the main villains get what they deserve. It seems justice prevailed. They wiped out the vermin at the root. But let's engage some critical thinking. Ask yourself a simple question. If everything really ended in May 1945, then where did the tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of these vermin disappear to? Did they evaporate, dissolve into thin air? No, they didn't evaporate. They simply changed their address. And today, I'm going to tell you the story in full detail, spicing it up with juicy facts from recently declassified archives. We'll talk about how SS officers became the fathers of space programs, how the Butcher of Lion advised presidents, and why Canada is still afraid to disclose the list of its honorary citizens. Get ready. This will be a long, sometimes shocking, but damn fascinating story. How the Ratlines became highways to a new life. When Soviet flags flew over the Reichstag in 1945 and the Allies celebrated victory, a realization dawned on the Nazi leadership. They suddenly understood that they would have to answer for their blitzkriegs, concentration camps, and gas chambers. But they didn't panic. The German mind, even in its death throes, worked clearly and pragmatically. And here's where it gets really interesting. They perfectly understood that surrendering to the Red Army meant certain death or a long journey to Siberia. But the Western Allies, they could negotiate with them. The guns of World War II had barely fallen silent when the Anglo-Saxon elites were already plotting a new war against their former ally, the USSR. And for this war, they needed professionals. Those who knew how to torture, how to conduct total espionage, and how to kill efficiently. Thus were born the famous Ratlines, a network of escape routes through which Nazis flowed out of Europe like water through fingers. The funniest and scariest part is that the term was coined by the Americans themselves. What irony! The U.S. intelligence service named the operation to save the Nazis after rats fleeing a sinking ship. And they did flee, but not into nothingness. They fled to warm, cozy holes that had already been prepared for them. There were two main routes. The first was the southern route, through Austria and Italy into Spain, and from there, a straight road to South America. The second went through Genoa and other Italian ports straight to the USA and Canada. And in Italy, they weren't helped by just anyone, but by men in cassocks. The Vatican. God will forgive and will help. The official Vatican, of course, still denies any involvement in this conveyor belt, claiming they weren't aware, it was just some enthusiast priests. But let's face the facts. The main logistician of this route was the Austrian Bishop Alois Hudel. This man sincerely considered Hitler a fighter against Bolshevism and harbored a fierce hatred for communists. What did Hudel do? He and his colleagues, like the Croatian priests Krunoslav Draganovic and Dominik Mandic, churned out forged documents. They turned Obersturmbannführers into pious refugees in need of protection from the Holy See. With these papers, the Nazis went to the Red Cross organization, and their chaos cues millions of refugees who needed thorough checks. No one. So, the Butcher of Treblinka, Franz Stangl, or the Deputy Commandant of Sobibor, Gustav Wagner, received a brand new Red Cross passport and a clear conscience. Why did the clergyman do this? The answer is simple and cynical. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. In the looming Cold War, the Nazis were ideal soldiers against the godless Soviet Union. It was a geopolitical calculation, seasoned with ideological affinity. Argentina. Perón, open the gates. So, documents ready, tickets booked. Where was the main flow heading? To South America, of course. And the main hub became Argentina. Why there? There's a whole bouquet of reasons. First, since the 19th century, there was a huge German diaspora there. By 1939, over 240,000 ethnic Germans lived in Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. Entire cities were built in the Bavarian style, with half-timbered houses and German schools. For example, the town of Blumenau in Brazil, tourists still think they've stepped into a Brothers Grimm fairy tale. Second, in 1946, Juan Perón came to power in Argentina. This charismatic leader openly sympathized with the Axis powers and called the Nuremberg trials an injustice. He needed technology, engineers, and military advisors to strengthen his power and industrialize the country. Where to get them? From the defeated but experienced Germans, of course. Perón essentially launched a state program for Nazi immigration. And here's a recent news item that would make any historian's hair stand on end. In 2025, Argentine President Javier Milei declassified archives. And now we have documentary proof of what we previously only guessed. Imagine, these archives contain 1,850 documents, visa applications, police reports. It's written in black and white how Adolf Eichmann, the main organizer of the Holocaust, entered the country with a Red Cross passport in the name of Ricardo Clement and got a job as an electrician at a Mercedes-Benz factory on the outskirts of Buenos Aires. He lived a quiet life, drove his kids to school, until the Mossad tracked him down and kidnapped him right off the street in 1960. And Joseph Mengele, the angel of death from Auschwitz, who experimented on twins and living people. He also escaped via the Italian route, got documents, and lived quietly in Buenos Aires, practicing illegal medicine and performing abortions. He even applied for a travel permit to West Germany in 1956. Only after Eichmann's kidnapping did he panic and flee to Paraguay and Brazil, where he died of a stroke in 1979, swimming at the beach. Sun, sea, palm trees, better than the Nuremberg gallows, right? And there were thousands like them. Erich Priebke, who shot 335 Italians at the Ardeatine Caves, escaped via the Vatican and lived in Argentina under his own name, running a German school. He was only exposed in 1995 and died in prison at the age of 100. The USA, Operation Paperclip, and Useful Idiots. But Argentina was just a resort for SS retirees. The most valuable, the smartest, the most needed cadres went straight to the USA and Great Britain. The Americans are practical people, and they launched a program that forever became a stain on their democracy. Operation Paperclip. Its essence was brilliantly cynical. They put a paperclip on the files of German scientists and intelligence officers if they were implicated in war crimes. But that didn't mean to prison. It meant, get them out quickly, before the Russians snatch them. Wernher von Braun, a name every schoolchild knows, the father of the American lunar program, creator of the Saturn V rocket. And before that, an SS Sturmbannführer and creator of the V-2 rockets that killed civilians in London and Antwerp. He personally selected prisoners from the Buchenwald concentration camp to work in his factories, where people died from exhaustion and forced labor. In the USA, he became a national hero. Irony? No, that's politics. The CIA and Army intelligence bought up former Gestapo officers, Abwehr employees, and Ukrainian nationalists wholesale. For example, Klaus Barbie, the head of the Lion Gestapo, nicknamed the Butcher of Lion, who personally tortured and killed members of the resistance, including women and children. After the war, he started working for American intelligence, which helped him move to Bolivia. There, he became an advisor to the president and taught Bolivian military how to torture the opposition, applying his rich experience. And there are tons of such examples. According to the Simon Wiesenthal Center, about 10,000 Nazi criminals settled in the USA. The CIA hid this data for years, and when they finally declassified a 600-page report, it was heavily edited. They were paid hush money, and if they were exposed, they were offered to quietly move back to Europe to avoid embarrassing Uncle Sam. Canada. Paradise for the SS Division Galicia. Canada deserves a separate discussion. It was a true mecca for Ukrainian collaborators. If the Americans were looking for scientists and spies, Canada simply opened its doors to ideological fighters against communism. Of the approximately 30,000 Ukrainian Nazis and their accomplices who fled to the West, the majority settled there. The Canadian government turned a blind eye to the fact that these men had served in the SS Division Galicia, participated in punitive operations, and murdered Poles and Jews. They were granted citizenship, they created cultural centers, published newspapers, and all of this was often state-funded. And this came back to bite them very recently in 2023. Remember that huge scandal when the Canadian Parliament gave a standing ovation to Jaroslav Hunka? That 98-year-old man who served in that very SS division. The Speaker of Parliament called him a Ukrainian hero. And when the truth came out, everyone, of course, started apologizing. But the funniest, in a cynical sense, part of this story is that Canada still refuses to publish the full archives of the Deschênes Commission, which investigated Nazi activities in the 80s. Why? The Russian Military Historical Society believes Ottawa is afraid these lists would harm Canada itself. They really wouldn't want the whole world to know how many Nazi criminals lived out their days peacefully in quiet Canadian towns. Afghanistan and the Middle East, a strange alliance. But that's not all. There were also exotic routes. For example, Afghanistan. 3 uncles of King Zahir Shah openly sympathized with the Nazis, who helped Afghans fight against the British. German advisors worked in Kabul during the war, and the Afghan economy was entangled in loans from German banks. So, a few high-ranking SS officers found refuge there too. Europe. Don't throw out dirty water. But the most widespread way to avoid punishment was the simplest: just don't run anywhere, stay in Europe. And this turned out to be easier than pie. The first Chancellor of West Germany, Konrad Adenauer, uttered a phrase that became the quintessence of West German policy. Don't throw out dirty water when you don't have clean water. What did this mean in practice? It meant that from 1952, former Nazis, including Gestapo employees, were allowed to hold public office in West Germany. In 1954, a law was passed that effectively exempted them from prosecution. Out of nearly 53,000 SS members directly involved in the extermination of people, only about 600 were brought to justice. 600. It's a drop in the ocean. The judges judging them had themselves worked side by side with them yesterday. What kind of justice is that? At the Nuremberg trials, which were actually the subsequent trials of doctors, lawyers, and industrialists, there was also a peculiar atmosphere. Generals who committed atrocities in the Balkans were released early in the early 50s. Industrialists who used slave labor from concentration camps were let out after a couple of years. The Cold War dictated its terms. Germany was needed as an ally, and harsh sentences against Germans were politically incorrect. The consequences we reap today. And this brings us to the most important point. What is all this long story for? It's to show that Nazism didn't go anywhere. It was simply repackaged, exported, preserved, and put back into circulation when the time was right. Those very people whom the USA and Canada sheltered in the 40s and 50s created the ideological basis for anti-Russian movements worldwide. They formed the World Anti-Communist League. They raised new generations of Russophobes. And today's aggressive policies in the Baltics, the Russophobic frenzy of part of the Ukrainian elite, the attempts to rewrite history, this is all the echo of those very decisions. The son of a Banderite or an SS man who received citizenship in the USA or Canada raised his children in an atmosphere of hatred for Russia. These children became ministers, senators, advisors, and now they promote the same ideas, just under new sauces: democracy, Euro-Atlantic values. Look at Germany today. People are in power whose grandfathers and grandmothers were perfectly respectable Nazis. And these are the ones now trying to cancel Russian culture, rewrite the history of World War II, and supply weapons to Ukraine. Friends, I told you this story not just to titillate your nerves. It's so you understand. The world isn't divided into black and white. The victory over Nazism in 1945 was a military victory. But the political war against it was lost by the West the moment they decided to use these people for their own selfish purposes. Today, Russia is the only country that consistently fights the rehabilitation of Nazism at the state level. And these aren't just words. It's the understanding that if you don't crush the viper in time, it will crawl out of its hole and bite you again. Which is essentially what we are now witnessing in Ukraine and Europe. If you found this interesting, if you learned something new, or if you want to argue, let it rip in the comments. It's very important to hear your opinion. Do you agree that the West deliberately preserved Nazi cadres, Or do you think it was an unavoidable cost of the Cold War? Right, don't be shy. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Coming up next, we'll analyze how the very same Ratlines are used today to transfer militants and drugs, and why modern history is just a remake of the 20th century. Talk to you soon.